Secretary of State Colin Powell and Mayor Giuliani of New York City. Thanks for joining us this morning.
This is a special late edition, America's New War. September 11th, 2001, another day that will live in infamy.
We will find those who did it. We will smoke them out of their holes. We will get them running, and we'll bring them to justice.
President Bush promises retaliation. What is justice American style? We'll ask Secretary of State Colin Powell. The U.S. Congress unites behind the president. We'll talk with the two leaders of the House of Representatives and with 5 prominent senators, the chairman and ranking members of both the Armed Services and Intelligence Committees, plus a key member of the Foreign Relations Committee who's also a Vietnam veteran. And as much of the world rushes to stand behind the United States, we'll ask Pakistan's ambassador to the U.S. about her country's commitment. Then, how could just 19 men cause such devastation? We'll ask 3 intelligence experts. And as America experiences renewed patriotism and faith, we'll have a discussion on helping America heal. Welcome to this special late edition. I'm Wolf Blitzer in Washington. Here are the latest developments in the aftermath of Tuesday's terrorist attacks in Washington and New York. A second person wanted as a material witness has been arrested and is in FBI custody in New York. Few details are known, but this second person was one of 25 people detained by U.S. immigration officials after the Tuesday attacks. The Pakistani government says it will ask the Taliban leadership in Afghanistan to hand over Osama bin Laden in 3 days or face massive military action led by U.S. forces. U.S. officials do not expect the Taliban to cooperate. According to today's Washington Post, the FAA alerted Air Defense Command that a hijacked jet was headed toward the Pentagon some 12 minutes before the plane hit, but apparently no one relayed that message to the building's security. 188 people are believed to have died in the Pentagon attack. Now let's check in with CNN reporters from around the world for the latest developments. First, we want to go to Kelly Wallace. She's at Camp David, Maryland. Then we'll go to Tom Mintier, who's in Islamabad, Pakistan. First, to you, Kelly. President Bush has stated that this campaign against terrorism will not be an overnight solution. Tell us what's going on today.
That's exactly right, Wolf. That is a message we hear from the president and all his top advisors on this day, preparing the American people for what they say could be a campaign that could last months, if not years. Actually, just a short time ago in the latest developments, Attorney General John Ashcroft speaking to reporters, announcing that he would be meeting with members of the U.S. Congress this afternoon and that he hopes to send up what he calls a comprehensive package to Capitol Hill in the next couple of days to upgrade and strengthen the laws on the books when it comes to fighting terrorism. The Attorney General talking about a number of new initiatives, such as elevating the penalties for those who harbor or assist terrorists. And he's also talking about wiretapping authority. The Attorney General saying big changes need to be made. He says the authority should be focused on the individual, not on the telephone. Here's what the Attorney General said a short time ago.
If a person ceases using one telephone and begins to use another telephone, we have to go back to court to get new authority. Now, most Americans, we all understand that you can buy disposable telephones now, use them for a limited period of time, and throw them away. And it simply doesn't make sense to have the surveillance authority associated with the hardware or with the phone instead of with the person or the terrorist.
And another of the president's top advisors, Vice President Dick Cheney, also out on the Sunday talk shows. Mr. Cheney saying the administration is, quote, quite confident that suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect behind Tuesday's attacks in New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. The vice president saying the administration is pleased that Pakistan, which neighbors Afghanistan believed to be where bin Laden is staying, has agreed to fully cooperate with the United States. The vice president making it clear the administration is delivering a tough message to countries around the world. Here's what the vice president said earlier on this day.
We're asking nations to step up and be counted. They're going to have to decide. Are they going to stand with the United States and believe in freedom and democracy and civilization, or are they going to stand with the terrorists and the barbarians, if you will? And it's a fairly clear-cut choice.
Well, John, the president has remained here throughout the weekend in Camp David.
And, Wolf, in the days ahead, we will see the administration, the president, President Bush, continuing to deliver the message that the American people should be prepared for a campaign, a political, economic, military campaign that won't be easy and certainly won't be short. At the same time, though, Wolf, the administration trying to encourage Americans to go back to work, to go back and get on with their lives. As a sign of some reassurance, Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill will be ringing the opening bell at the start of the New York Stock Exchange on Monday. Wolf, back to you.
Kelly Wallace near Camp David, thank you very much. And as Kelly just reported, the Pakistani government says it does plan to demand that Afghanistan hand over Osama bin Laden, the man President Bush says is the prime suspect in these attacks. CNN's Tom Mintier joins us now live from Islamabad, Pakistan. Tom?
Wolf, that message is going to be delivered by a high-level Pakistani delegation that will go to Kandahar to meet with the Taliban leadership tomorrow. It is a message that is pretty simple, according to sources who tell CNN. It is hand over Osama bin Laden in the next 2 or 3 days or face the possible consequences which could lead to military action. That message will be delivered to the Taliban, and as U.S. officials are already responding to a story we've been reporting for several hours here on CNN, they don't expect it to be a successful mission. Today, President Musharraf was out at his house meeting with about 3 different delegations, each one about 30 people each, media leaders, editorial writers, scholars, religious leaders, all coming to his house for a meeting to be briefed, basically bringing them into his confidence of what is going to take place, what Pakistan's role will be. Now, I did talk to the Secretary of Information during that meeting, and he admitted to me that Pakistan would send a delegation to deliver a message to the Taliban.
There is a small delegation going, but I would not like to comment on any kind of an ultimatum having been given by anyone. I'm not aware of any kind of an ultimatum. But I do confirm that there is a small delegation that is going.
Ultimatum is not a word used by diplomats. They urge, they nudge, they warn, they deliver messages. And this is basically what's going to take place in Kandahar, a message being delivered by the Pakistani delegation going to visit the Taliban, their close allies, to tell them to hand over Osama bin Laden in the next 2 or 3 days or face the consequences. Wolf?
Tom, I was in Pakistan last year, and as you know, and as most people who cover Pakistan know, there is an extensive network of support for Osama bin Laden within Pakistan, perhaps even within the Pakistani military. How significant of a factor of a restraint on the Pakistani government is that sympathy, if you will, for Osama bin Laden?
Well, I think looking at all the confidence building that's going on today, for the president to spend an entire day late into the night, they expect the meetings to go on until midnight, bringing them into his confidence to tell them basically what the plan, what the agreement is with the United States. He's really laying it out on the table, his position, his agreement with U.S. President George W. Bush on what role Pakistan might play if military action is required. Now, some of the religious leaders that I talked to this afternoon said they would like to see the evidence the United States has of direct involvement by Osama bin Laden. In the meantime, they say they will support whatever the president of Pakistan decides to do as far as assistance to the United States in this crisis.
Tom Mentir in Islamabad, thank you very much. And we'll get the U.S. reaction to these latest developments from the Secretary of State, Colin Powell, just a few minutes. But first, let's get the latest information on the recovery effort at Ground Zero in New York City. Joining us now is the Governor of New York, George Pataki. Governor, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, our condolences to the people of your state, to the people in New York City. I know this must be an extremely wrenching moment for all of you, but tell us, first of all, is there any hope out there that there will be survivors found in that rubble?
Well, Wolf, it is a very difficult time, but I've never seen New Yorkers come together the way they have, and the spirit is strong, and I've never seen America come together the way it has. And the fact that we here at Ground Zero know that millions of Americans are praying for us, helping us, and millions of people around the world gives us great confidence. With respect to survivors, there's still hope. You know, as every hour goes by, the hope becomes a little weaker, a little fainter. But we've seen in earthquakes where people lived 8, 9, 10 days afterwards, and there are tunnels under the World Trade Center. So this is still a search and rescue operation, and it might take a miracle for someone still to be found alive. But there are a lot of people out there praying for miracles, so we're just praying and working in the hopes that that miracle might happen.
Are you getting, Governor Pataki, everything you need from the federal government?
Wolf, it's been incredible. I spoke to President Bush before 9:30 Tuesday morning, and since that time, absolutely every request has been met. And in fact, the administration has sent us things proactively before we've even asked for them. And, you know, Wolf, probably the most important thing that New York needed was President Bush's visit on Friday. That really lifted the morale and the spirit of the thousands of people right behind me now risking their lives in a dangerous effort to get through this, and it lifted the spirits of all New Yorkers, and we were very grateful that he didn't just drop in. He came, spent hours at the site, spent hours with the families, and it was very reassuring and uplifting to us.
What about additional assistance from volunteers out there? Is there any need for people watching this program, for example, around the United States, maybe even around the world, to come to New York and help in any specific way?
Wolf, not at this time. I'll tell you, it's been wonderful, the outpouring of support. I was at our Javits Center where we're coordinating volunteers yesterday, and we had people from South Texas, from California, from across the world who had come to help us out, but we are adequately staffed. What we're doing is rotating teams through, but to people who want to help, don't come here. We don't need you here now, but you can help. You can join your fire company, join your ambulance corps at home, support the Salvation Army and the Red Cross, and of course you can donate funds, because there are not just thousands of victims, but thousands and thousands of their children and families who are going to need our help as we go through this.
There's been a lot of speculation these past few days whether the people of New York should rebuild those World Trade Center twin towers. Would that be a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, if I'll tell you, we are a spirited and strong people, and we're not going to simply leave a crater where we had a symbol of New York. We're working right now. Monday, the New York Stock Exchange will reopen, the Mercantile Exchange will reopen, the NASDAQ will reopen. What the form of the rebuilding will take, no one can say. It's too soon. But New Yorkers will rebuild. We will continue to be the world financial capital. We will continue to have confidence in the unity, the spirit, the strength of New Yorkers, coupled with the tremendous help from people around the country, are going to allow us not just to get through this. We're going to come through this, and we're going to be stronger.
Governor, should New Yorkers be concerned that there still may be terrorists out there who have their sights set on New York?
You know, Wolf, I think the fact that the president did come in Friday within 3 days of this horrible attack speaks an awful lot about his confidence in the security of New York City. And as I said, he spent hours here and spent a lot of time grieving and inspiring people who needed that type of help. So I think that shows us that the federal government is confident that everything that can be done from a security standpoint is being done. It's being done by the city, and the Giuliani administration has been spectacular in their leadership in dealing with this. It's been being done by the state, and the federal government has been just tremendous in their support. But, you know, terrorism strikes in ways that, like this horrible attack, no one foresaw, no one predicted. So I don't think it's just New York, it's all of America. that has to be on alert, and we also have to support the president because he has said this is a war, this is an attack upon our way of life, and he is right. We have to go after those terrorists wherever they may be in the world, including governments that harbor those terrorists. The people of New York will be united and stand with the president in this. The people of America will be united and stand with the president in this, because this was not an attack on one city. This was not an attack aimed at creating a few thousand deaths. This was an attack on our freedom. This was an effort to take away our spirit. It's not going to work. We're going to stand with the president.
Governor George Pataki, thank you so much for joining us. And later in our program, I'll be speaking with the mayor of New York City, Rudy Giuliani. But now let's go back to the diplomatic effort involving the United States to try to put together a coalition against terrorism. Earlier today, I spoke with the Secretary of State, Colin Powell. Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us. Who's responsible for these attacks?
Well, the prime suspect, I think, is the al-Qaeda organization, which is essentially a holding company of terrorist organizations that have worldwide presence, and the head of the al-Qaeda organization is Osama bin Laden. Now, the evidence is still mounting, but that organization, al-Qaeda, is the prime suspect.
Do you believe that other terrorist organizations were cooperating with al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden?
We don't have enough information yet to make that case, but we're looking at every lead we have. Right now, the prime suspect is al-Qaeda, which is headed by Osama bin Laden.
Is there any evidence that any state in the region or around the world may have supported, financed, directed this operation?
We have not seen any such links yet, but you can believe we're working hard to see whether such links exist.
How do you do that? How do you find out if there are such links?
Well, as you know, the FBI and other agencies of government are hard at work. Some 4,000 FBI agents are working on this, and as they look at those 19 terrorists who killed themselves last September 11th, they will start to turn up leads, and they'll follow those leads and follow them wherever it takes them. One, to make sure there are no other terrorists loose in the country, and if there are, let's get after them and get on them and roll it up. And also to find out the origins of this group and to go after those origins and pull up the sources and to find those who gave them haven, those who gave them support, those who gave them financial support, and start ripping up this entire network. That's why we keep saying it's going to be a long-term campaign against this enemy, whether it is al-Qaeda or any other terrorist organization that comes after us, our interest, or frankly goes after the civilized world.
When you say long-term, how long?
We're probably going to be in the counterterrorism business at a very high level of intensity for as long as anyone can imagine, as long as there are people out there who are willing to do the kinds of things those terrorists did this week. Then we're going to have to be on guard and constantly looking for them, trying to penetrate them and trying to stop them, and not just respond to them, but to stop them, get ahead of them, get inside their decision cycle.
This is not weeks or months, but this is years.
No, in the near term, we will go after the specific organization responsible for what happened at the World Trade Center at the Pentagon. And we'll get the evidence, and we'll get the goods on them, and we'll go after them. And we've already started that. You've seen the diplomatic effort that we've made over the last 4 or 5 days, which has produced results already. And then we will do whatever is necessary to take care of this organization and make sure they are not able to commit this kind of offense against us again and against the civilized world. It's important to remember that it's not just U.S. citizens that were lost here. Some 40 countries lost people in the World Trade Center, and they're all outraged. The whole world is outraged over this kind of terrorist incident, and it has to be a worldwide response, a worldwide campaign using all the tools that are available to the United States and available to like-minded nations around the world who see this as a scourge on the face of the earth to do something about it.
As you know, Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, his organization, have operated within Afghanistan, supported, if you will, by the Taliban regime over there. The United States occasionally talks to the Taliban leadership. What are you saying to them right now?
Well, we're not talking to them right now, but I expect we will be in the days ahead. And we're going to make it clear to them that they must comply with previous directions they have received from the United Nations and other organizations to stop this, to expel this organization, to destroy this organization, or to help us to destroy this organization. And they will be held accountable for the support they have given to this organization if that's who we finally determined is responsible and we're going after them. They will have to make their choice, whether they want to be in the receiving end of the full wrath of the United States and others, or whether they want to get rid of this curse that they have within their country.
Do you have any expectation that they will change their policy and cooperate now with the U.S. and the West and arrest, if you will, Osama bin Laden?
I'm not carrying an expectation. The only thing I'm looking for is results. They either do or they don't. It's binary, yes or no. You either respond to this crisis, this tragedy, this horrible thing that was perpetrated by perhaps al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and all the indications point in that direction. You either respond and rip them up, help us rip them up, get rid of them, or you will suffer consequences.
Now, specifically, what does that mean to the Taliban who may be watching right now? What kind of consequences will they suffer?
They will suffer consequences. We have a variety of means at our disposal, which are political, diplomatic, international, military, intelligence, lots of things that are available to us. All the elements of national power will be brought to bear on this problem. And the Taliban have a problem right now in hosting this kind of regime in the form of the al-Qaeda regime, the al-Qaeda network, and those who support the al-Qaeda network. And they will have to make a choice as to whether or not they're willing to pay the price that they may have to pay to continue to support this kind of activity.
As you well know, there have been reports over the years that this organization, al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's troops and forces, have also operated in Yemen, in Sudan, and other countries. Are you giving them the same warning?
Yes, we are talking to all of our friends and partners in this coalition. And what we're saying to them, not necessarily warning, but saying to them, look, this is the time to end this. Whatever host support you have been providing to this network, stop it. There are UN resolutions and there are other directions from international communities that these things should be ejected from your country, these kinds of cells, this kind of activity. And we're just going to remind them of their responsibilities and let them know it'll be a means by which we measure our relationship with them in the future. Not necessarily a warning, it's just a clear statement of fact and principle that we're going after them, and you can either help us go after them, and if you choose not to help us go after them, this will have an effect on the relationship that we have with you.
There are reports this morning that the government of Pakistan is now about to send a delegation into Afghanistan and demand the arrest of Osama bin Laden. Did you ask Pakistan to do that?
We've asked Pakistan for a number of things. I have seen that report, and our ambassador in Islamabad is in touch with Pakistani authorities, and I know the Pakistani ambassador will be on your show a little later this morning, but I cannot confirm yet exactly what the Pakistanis might be doing tomorrow. I know that there is movement in such a direction, and I know that the Pakistanis have made some contacts in the UN on such a move, but we will wait to see. But I am not in a position right now to confirm it.
Have you been in direct touch? I know the President has spoken to President Musharraf, Pervez Musharraf, the leader of Pakistan. What specifically has the United States asked Pakistan to do?
Well, as you know, the President did speak to him yesterday. I spoke to President Musharraf several days earlier, and Deputy Secretary Armitage spoke to some associates of the President who were in town, and we gave them a list of things that we thought they should be responsive to, and we would be giving them greater specificity with respect to what we wanted off that list in due course. But since that is a matter of, as you can imagine, sensitive diplomatic discussions between the two sides, I think it's best that we follow up on that list. They have come forward with a very supportive statement. They have said yes. And President Musharraf said that to President Bush again last night. And so what we now have to do is send a team to Islamabad as soon as we have a better idea of what we will need and what kind of support might be required, and talk directly to our Pakistani friends.
When will that team leave, and who will head the delegation?
Not yet been decided, but I'm sure it'll not be in the distant future. I would expect in the very near future, the next several days. And we'll put the team together and determine who the head will be. And when they go over, they will be also working with our Ambassador Wendy Chamberlain, who's been doing such a great job over the last 4 days.
Is one of the statements issued by the government of Pakistan is that they will cooperate as long as you don't get the Israelis and the Indians, the government of Israel, the government of India, involved in this, because presumably they would be embarrassed. What is your reaction to that?
Well, we'll see what their position is. We'll talk to them. And right now, you know, we're not planning we do not have a multi national force going anywhere yet. And so we understand the sensitivities that would be involved in anything that might involve India or Israel, and we'll take those sensitivities into account. But at the end of the day, we'll do what we think is appropriate and necessary.
Have the Pakistanis agreed to allow the U.S. to go over their airspace with missiles or with planes if, in fact, there is going to be a military operation aimed at Afghanistan?
What we're going to do is sit down with the Pakistanis and discuss with them what we might need. I don't want to give any indication or hints as to what might or may not be planned as a military operation or a diplomatic operation or any kind of international initiative at this time.
What about their ground positions as staging points or their ports for U.S. naval vessels?
We have not approached them yet on any specific requirements, and when we do, it'll be in a confidential channel, so we are not giving any indication of what we might or might not be doing militarily.
If you look at the map of Afghanistan, it's landlocked. To the north is Uzbekistan, one of the republics of the former Soviet Union. Is there any need for cooperation, for example, from Uzbekistan?
We will be talking to the Uzbek authorities. There may be something they can assist us with, but we'll explore that with them.
And as you know,
they have been forthcoming.
To the west is Iran. Any prospect at all of seeking or receiving cooperation from Iran?
Iran has always had difficulty with the Taliban regime and recognized the nature of that regime. And they gave a rather forthcoming statement of condolence and how there might be ways of cooperating with us in the response to what happened. But at the same time, we have always seen Iran as a state that sponsors terrorism. So we will explore what they have said to us without making any commitments, of course. And if they are interested in fighting terrorism, it has to be terrorism not just related to this incident, but terrorism of the kind that they have sponsored in the past. So if this represents a new page in Iranian thinking, then let's see what's written on that new page. But we're prepared to explore, but we have no illusions about the nature of the Iranian regime.
So you'd want them specifically, for example, to back off in their support of Hezbollah?
Yeah, they can't say we will help you fighting terrorism here, but we will not help you fighting terrorism elsewhere. Terrorism is terrorism, and Hezbollah is a threat to the region, just as Al-Qaeda is a threat to the world. And I think we have to see this not only as a struggle against what happened the other day and a struggle against Al-Qaeda, if that's who we ultimately determined we should go against, but there are other acts of terrorism that take place perpetrated by other terrorist organizations. And so it is a scourge, as I said before, against civilization, and we have to go against this scourge in the most comprehensive way possible.
Are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other states in the Gulf, in the Persian Gulf region, with whom the United States has close relations, are they ready to cooperate militarily with the United States in this new war?
They are ready to cooperate. They have all been supportive. Now, we have not asked them for any particular military component to that cooperation yet, but I have been very impressed by the speed with which our moderate Arab friends in the region have come forward to express condolence and also show support. Saudi Arabia particularly reminded everybody that they stripped Osama bin Laden of his citizenship years ago and consider him a disgrace to his Saudi heritage. Senior Saudi clerics have spoken out strongly against this kind of activity in the last several days. I'm pleased with that. We've also heard from Israel and so many other friends. So lots of people are coming forward, but we haven't placed any specific military requirements or demands or requests on any of them yet.
Where does the Iraqi President Saddam Hussein fit into this entire scenario for war?
Well, he is one of the more despicable persons on the face of the earth, and we have not heard, of course, and wouldn't expect to hear from the Iraqis any sense of understanding of this loss of life that affected not just the United States, but 40 other nations, to include Arab nations who lost lives in the World Trade Center. So far, we have not discerned any link between the Iraqi government and what happened the other day, but we are certainly examining links that might exist between what happened the other day and any country and any terrorist organization in the world. We're determined to run this to ground, get them out of their holes, pull it all out, see what's there, and then deal with it.
Over the years, since your experience as a young officer in Vietnam and during the course of your more subsequent experience, you've come up with what's called the Powell Doctrine. a defined mission, overwhelming force, exit strategy. Let's go through that right now. What is the defined mission?
To make sure that nothing like this happens again, and to make sure nothing like this happens again by going after the sources, the terrorist sources and those who harbor terrorist activities and terrorist groups, and destroying those networks, those groups, and making sure it is no longer in anyone's interest to harbor or provide haven for such groups.
It sounds like a very broadly defined mission.
Broad? No, I think it's pretty specific. It is a broad mission, but it is a very specific mission.
Overwhelming force. What should that require?
It requires political, diplomatic, intelligence, law enforcement, financial, and military effort, all coming together in a campaign. And nobody should think this is going to be, we go in and it's over in 2 days and we're out. This is going to change the way we do business. It's going to change the way we go about our daily life here in the United States. It's going to require a greater emphasis on homeland defense, so we can defend ourselves against those who, notwithstanding our best efforts overseas, are still trying to get in to the country to hurt us. And so we should see this as a long-term campaign and do apply decisive force to it. And that force isn't just military force. It's all the elements of national power that are at our disposal.
Presumably beyond the 50,000 reservists and National Guard troops who are being activated, the number could go way up.
But don't just see it in terms of activating reservists. The Pentagon has a fabulous force, all of whom now want to be a part of this campaign. But just don't see it in those distinctly military terms. Because, in fact, going after a lot of these cells and finding these people, it's more in an intelligence war, and we've got a great intelligence community. It's a law enforcement war. It's finding out how they get their finances, how do they move people, how do they cover people when they get into a place like the United States. They were in this country legally. And so it's that kind of a war, which isn't just a military war. It's a different kind of war. And the so-called Powell Doctrine, as you describe it, can cover this kind of contingency as well. Use all the force at your disposal, make sure you know what you're going after, and stick with it until you succeed, get that decisive victory.
And what is the exit strategy?
That was never part of the Powell Doctrine, but I'll accept the question. The exit strategy is when we know that the American people are living in safety without this kind of a threat. And it may be a long time before we can create such circumstances again, but we'll get there because we're a proud people, we're strong people. Notwithstanding the depth of this tragedy and the sadness it is inflicted upon our nation, look at the strength that has emerged. Look at how people are shaking each other's hands and hugging each other again, and going to our churches and mosques and synagogues, and reinforcing our belief in our society. They can knock down buildings, they can kill thousands of us and cause so many Americans to grieve. They can't destroy our society, they can't destroy who we are, they can't destroy America.
Since 1976, when President Ford was in the White House, there's been this executive order on the books. Let me read it to you. No person employed by or acting on behalf of the United States government shall engage in or conspire to engage in assassination. Is it time to change that?
That it is still on the books, and as part of our campaign plan, we're examining everything. How the CIA does its work, how the FBI and Justice Department does its work. Are there laws that need to be changed or new laws brought into effect to give us more ability to deal with this kind of threat? So everything is under review.
What's the difference now as opposed to 10 years ago when you led the U.S. military, you were chairman of the Joint Chiefs in the Gulf War? What's the biggest difference between this war and that war?
That war was easy to see, easy to define, with an enemy that essentially sat there waiting to be attacked when we finally did attack it. In this case, the enemy is clever, more resourceful, broken down across the world in many, many countries in small cells, doing everything to remain hidden with a long time horizon. They will take months and years to plan an operation. And so it is a much more difficult enemy to find and fix. But that's what we're working on, finding them and fixing them. And when we find them and fix them, then we will go in and finish them.
So what I'm hearing you saying is that there still may be terrorists at large, even here in the United States right now.
I can't ignore that possibility. It would be foolish to do so. And I can assure you that the law enforcement activities of the United States government are following every lead. 4,000 FBI agents are working this in the field. Another 3,000 support personnel are working. The CIA and many other agencies are hard at work using their vast resources to go after this problem and to deal with that possibility.
And finally,
at the same time, even though there may be people wandering around, America has got to get back to work. We've got to get back to some sense of normalcy. If we stick in our bunkers and walk around afraid, they will have won. Well, we're not a fearful people. We know how to overcome tragedy, and we will restore a sense of normalcy to this society, to this country very quickly in a way that will impress the world.
On that note, let me thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolf.
And we'll get reaction from the congressional leadership of the House of Representatives shortly. But first, I want to go back to New York, where CNN's Aaron Brown has just accompanied the U.S. Coast Guard and viewed the awesome destruction from the air. These are the first aerial pictures from New York that CNN has. Aaron, walk us through precisely what you have.
We will do that. Wolf, good morning to you. We're on Staten Island looking across to the southern tip of Manhattan. You can just see the smoke. And in fact, from here, you can hardly tell, other than the smoke, that anything happened. We were coming in on a small Coast Guard cutter to get to the helicopter, and it wasn't until we were, honestly, almost offshore that you began to see the extent of the damage. Then you get in the air. And when you get in the air, it unfolds in front of you. We thought, to be perfectly honest, we would be shocked by what we saw, and we can only assume that we've seen so much since Tuesday, we are temporarily shocked out. In fact, as we came around the southern tip of the island and started to move in closer, it was almost a sense of awe. Awe at the audaciousness of the plan, awe at the evil brilliance of the plan, awe at the power that those two jet bombs, fully loaded wide-body jets, their power to destroy. It turns out, as sometimes is the case, the cliches in many cases are true. As you come around the island, we're moving now to the west, around the southern tip of Manhattan Island. The Trade Center towers would have been just in front as we zoom past that building. Just in front of there, tower number 1 would have been right there, right where you're looking in between those two buildings. Now we're farther to the west looking back. You see the smoke. To us at least, it is a much wider area of damage than we thought it was from our location from where we've been broadcasting. There's a huge hole in the middle. And I'll venture a guess here, and it's only that as one of the two towers came tumbling down, it crashed on top of what I believe was building number 5 of the World Trade Center complex. As we say, the cliches turn out in many ways to be true. It does look like Mount St. Helens in an urban setting erupted. Oddly enough, it could have been a kind of modern Germany at the end of World War II, after the Allies moved in, bombing Germany. But it is in this relatively tight 8 or 10 block area. It's not vast across the city. It's just focused on this small area. It is also somewhat sickening when you look down and you see the dirt and the steel and the concrete, the water pouring on it all, and you realize as we stand here on this beautiful September Sunday morning in New York, there are 5,000 people still buried. Wolf?
Aaron, did you get close enough to convey to our viewers what obviously these pictures, as dramatic as they are, and our photographer Dave Rust has done his usually excellent job in getting these pictures. Did you get a sense what maybe we can't appreciate the sense of smell?
Yeah, I've been smelling this smell, Wolf, since I guess sometime Tuesday. It is. I leave and it's all over me, and even at 1,500 feet, and maybe I'm imagining this. I can't promise I'm not, yeah, you could smell it. And you would see, and we hadn't seen this before, from the upper stories of some of the surrounding buildings, fire department has run hoses up to the top stories and is pouring literally thousands, if not millions and millions of gallons down on that smoldering mass of death and destruction.
All right, Aaron Brown in New York. I'm sure we'll be seeing more of these pictures as the day continues and as these days continue. Thank you so much for joining us. And let's get back to congressional action and reaction now from Capitol Hill. We turn to two top members of the U.S. House of Representatives. Joining us in our Dallas bureau, the House Majority Leader, Dick Armey of Texas, and here in Washington, the House Minority Leader, Dick Gephardt of Missouri. Gentlemen, thanks to both of you for joining us. First of all, Mr. Armey, I just want to get your reaction, and I'll ask Mr. Gephardt for the same reaction, your reaction to what we just saw, those pictures that Aaron Brown described.
Well, obviously, the first thing you realize is just how, as Aaron says, how expansive that damage is. And, of course, it again, I suppose, is a graphic reminder. We've got some rebuilding to do, and this, I think, speaks directly to where the Congress of the United States can be most beneficially helpful to the people of New York, to the nation, and to the future of this country.
What about that, Mr. Gephardt?
Well, obviously, we agree with that. Just looking at these pictures, I'm taking what 19 people, in this case 4 or 5 people, maybe 10 people could do. They did what Japan and Germany couldn't do in World War II, what all of our adversaries through history couldn't do. We lost more people on our soil than in any conflict in history. It makes me very sad and sympathetic with the people who died and their families, and it makes me angry. And I want to get to the bottom of this, and I want New York to recover, I want our nation to recover, and I want this never to happen again.
Congressman Armey, is it time for the Congress to go beyond the resolution that you passed the other day and formally enact a declaration of war?
We will, I think, no. No, I don't think it's time for a declaration of war. It's time to seriously assess what exactly would be the espionage, investigation, and enforcement, apprehension and enforcement requirements. This is going to be more covert operations than overt operations. We will give the government the tool it needs to to deal with the guilty, but we will also always, as we are as a nation, preserve the rights of the innocent, and that will be as paramount as can be. So it will be a very cautious thing, a thorough thing, done with a sense of differentiation between innocence and guilt, with a mutual commitment to the innocent, as our commitment has been so aptly expressed to the guilty.
Congressman Gephardt, do you agree with that?
I think what we passed the other day, almost without a dissenting vote, was a authorization for the president to use force against the people, organizations, or countries that contributed to this horrible disaster, and to try to prevent further disasters. He has the authority to marshal the forces of the United States to do that. The night before, as you know, we appropriated what may be the beginning, or hopefully will help toward the recovery and help in the defense effort. So Congress, as Dick has said, has given the president the resources and the authority that we need, and with the help and the great bravery of the American people, I think we're going to see this through.
Congressman Armey, based on what you're hearing, tell the American public right now and the people around the world watching this program what kind of strike, what kind of military action they should be prepared to observe from the United States.
Well, they might be prepared to not observe it at all, in the sense that we all watch Desert Storm. Basically, what you have is these snakes are in their holes, scattered around the country, world, plotting and scheming. We got to find where they are, and we got to kill them before they get out of their holes. And that's not necessarily going to be something that the American people are going to see as it happens, or hear a great deal about it in any kinds of detail before it happens. It is something that has to be carried out in the same way they carry out their activities, behind quiet doors and in a sense under the cloak of secrecy. We have to do the same. You've got to use their tactics to catch them.
But Congressman Army, should the American public be prepared for a U.S. military invasion of Afghanistan where the Taliban regime harbors, protects Osama bin Laden's al-Qaeda organization, as we heard from Secretary of State Colin Powell?
I believe that will depend a great deal on the Taliban and how they react. If they react with defiance and arrogance, if they say not only will we harbor these people, but we will foster these activities, they could be calling that wrath very clearly and very specifically upon themselves. So they have an opportunity to follow that great adage that a word to the warning is a wise thing for them to heed, and we're giving them that advice. You know, clean up your act and do not foster these people that will perpetrate these kinds of atrocities.
Congressman Gephardt, CNN and USA Today and Gallup have just come out with a new poll taken over the past few days. And a question that we asked the American public was this: would you support U.S. military action if it lasts for several months or several years? Several months, 86% said yes. The numbers are up on the screen. Several years, 66% said yes. Overwhelming support for U.S. military action.
Wolf, this is a modern-day equivalent of Pearl Harbor. The American people did what it took in World War II. It took 5 years and the loss of thousands of American troops. The American people sacrificed. The American people saved money, bought U.S. bonds, did without a lot of things that they were used to. Everybody did their part. It was a national unity effort, and I think you're going to see that very same thing with this.
Congressman Army, another question we asked in our CNN USA Today Gallup poll was this: would you support U.S. military action if it required ground troops? 80% said yes. And if it led to 1,000 U.S. deaths, 65% said yes. Do you think it will come down to ground troops and those kinds of numbers as far as U.S. casualties are concerned?
It's hard to tell. My guess is ground troops, as it were, strategic ground forces, can be deployed in this matter. I think they will need to be in some instances. But again, I don't think you ought to see a broad sweeping campaign of tanks crossing a desert in some sort of formation. You're going to see very strategic placements of operations that are going to look perhaps more like a SWAT team cleaning out a den of thieves than it is going to be like a conventional military operation we see in mind.
Well, that sounds like special operations forces, the Delta Force. Is that what you're suggesting?
I think that's what you have to understand. You know, the good news is these are not great nation states at war with one another. These are not hundreds of thousands of people engaged in the field of battle. These are a very vicious and very dangerous, awful, but relatively small, strategically placed group of people, and it takes very well focused and strategically placed energies to come right at them very clearly and very specifically. It's like cutting a cancer out of an otherwise fairly healthy body.
Well, Congressman Army, let me follow up on that point, though. As you well remember, and our viewers remember, the former Soviet Union felt the same way about what was happening in Afghanistan in the late 1980s. They paid a dear price for it. Of course, was there Vietnam, given the terrain, given the guerrillas who were fighting there. What's to say that if the U.S. were to go in Afghanistan, the U.S. wouldn't have the same experience that the former Soviet Union had?
Well, the terrain would be the same and so forth, but the mission is different than what the Soviet Union had in mind. And you're going to find in Afghanistan a great many people that understand that the American presence in their land will be, at what time it might take place, a presence in defense of freedom, not in the quest of territory. And you might find that our ability to operate with the right values for the right purposes on that terrain might be far greater than what the Soviets experienced in their day.
You agree with that, Congressman Gephardt?
Wolf, I think we can't predict what form this response and this effort will take. This is a new foe. It's more complicated. It's more difficult to get at its heart and its operation. I think we've got to be ready for all kinds of things. As the President and Secretary of State have said repeatedly in the last days, We're going to fight on the diplomatic front. We're going to fight on the military front. We're going to go at their finances. We're going to go at increasing our intelligence. We've got to be as smart and creative and wily as these people are. And while we're taking out the cancer, as Dick said, we got to make sure we're not creating new cancers that can come at us. 19 people with their supporters used our credit cards, our education system, our airplanes, and our people to attack ourselves. That's a new form of warfare. We've got to understand their motivation, how they operate, how they organize, and we got to take them out, and we have to make sure it never happens again.
Congressman Gephardt, how do you do that, though, without undermining the basic liberties, the freedoms that all Americans have?
Wolf, I said the first day of this matter, we're going to have to rebalance the trade-off, the balance between freedom and security in our country. Now, that's going to cause some controversial decisions in some cases. Those are going to be hard decisions to make. We got to do it in a small d democratic way, getting input from our people. But I see no way, given this new dangerous world that we're in, that we can have the amount of openness and freedom. Just look at airline travel. You're going to have to go through inconveniences to get on an airplane now that we'll all gladly go through, but it's going to change our life in fundamental ways.
Let me press you on a specific point. Are you saying, therefore, that in terms of airline security, that ethnic profiling of passengers should be used?
I don't think that, but I think there are a lot of things we got to consider. Some people are saying we ought to have marshals on every airplane. We got to look at that. We ought to have steel cockpit doors that no one can go through for any reason. We've got to have more security checks and interviews before people get on planes. In Israel and other countries, they've had these kinds of means in the past. We got to look at all of that and consider all of it and do some of it. Now, that's going to change the openness and freedom of our society, but I think the first job of our society is to keep our people safe and to make sure this never happens again.
Congressman Army, are you prepared to trade off some of those basic freedoms and liberties that Americans enjoy in exchange for better security?
I'm very protective about that, but Wolf, this is the genius of democracy. We know in this, within a democracy, how to get tough and put in rigorous regimens of discipline, security, without trespassing against the fundamental rights of human beings in a civilized society. There will be, as Dick said, inconvenience, but we will not violate people's basic rights as we make this nation more secure. We can do that in democracies. It can't be done in tyrannies, because tyrannies do not enjoy the general goodwill and support of the people who are willing to suffer inconvenience in good nature with a confidence that the nation will protect their rights. This can be done. It'll take careful planning. It'll take thorough thinking. It'll take rigorous implementation. But America can do that because we are a free nation.
And Wolf, Dick is right. We can't take away people's civil liberties, and we can't do some of the things we did in the past. In World War II, we put Japanese Americans in jail. We interned them simply because they were of a certain ethnic background. We cannot do that now. There are incidents, a few that have happened in our country unhappily against Arab Americans, Muslims. We've got to guard in every way against these kinds of things happening. We must not divide our nation. We must not hate one another. We must not be prejudiced and discriminate against one another.
Yeah, I should mention, Wolf, the Good Shepherd, he protects the innocent sheep while he slaughters the guilty wolf, and we can do that in America. We will do so.
Congressman Army, you passed $40 billion, probably in a record pace over the past few days. Is it your sense that that's it, or will additional huge sums be required to help the United States in this war?
Well, obviously we've got to reconstruct the nation, the damage that's inflicted by this, and that will take some direct expenditure as we also improve our resources to deal with future events and maintain security. But we have broader issues that we have to understand. We need to understand, this is the nerve center of not only the nation's economy, but the world's economy. Serious damage was inflicted, most immediately obvious on the airlines, as they have had to have what for them is a very difficult period where they've shut down their operations in compliance with the government for the protection of the American people. So we will have to come back in, look at those specific areas where we can shore up this economy and how we can, in fact, maintain. Dick talked about being successful on the diplomatic front, the economic front, the military front. We've got to be strong in all those areas too. So we will be looking at where these needs are and how to rebuild and reconstruct the strength of this economy, because that's where we resource the nation for all that we hope to accomplish.
Does that mean, Congressman Army, that you're prepared now to support an emergency supplemental aid bailout, if you will, for the airline industry, which obviously is in deep trouble and several major airlines potentially could collapse as a result of this?
Well, I certainly would not use the word bail. I am willing to look at what this nation can do in gratitude and appreciation for the airlines, for the sacrifice they made to protect this nation's security in response to the federal government. And we should understand, the first victims of this assault were two of our airlines. They were the first to lose people, they were the first to lose assets and resources. And we've got to appreciate that, even in their own period of difficulty, knowing the cost to themselves. When this government said, for the safety and security of the American people, suspend your operations, we need to be aware that they stepped right up and they did it. And we need to understand, this is not a bailout. This is our way of compensating them for the sacrifice they made, as we do all over this nation, for the security of all.
If some of those, Congressman Gephardt, if some of those airlines go out of business, that could have a severe, very grave effect on the entire U.S. economy. Are you ready now to get involved and make sure that that money is approved in the next few days?
Yes.
And how much money are we talking about?
Well, I'd hoped we could do it the other night. It wasn't possible. It was late at night, and we didn't have all the facts in front of us. And there were people that didn't want to go forward, and we can't do that in our Congress. But we're going to try to do that, I think, even this next week. The Speaker and I talked yesterday, and we're going to try to put together with Dick Armey and others a bipartisan group this week, early this week, to talk it through and to find out the facts. We cannot allow such an important part of our economic infrastructure fall down simply because of an act of war. So we're going to do what's necessary, what's right. We're going to do it with common sense and with the right facts in front of us.
Congressman Armey, is this going to be a bipartisan leadership sort of bill?
Yes, it is. And I have to tell you, Wolf, if those bad boys thought they were going to divide this nation or destroy its spirit, they were sadly wrong. And the best mirror of how wrong they are is the way we've worked together in the Congress of the United States. Politics is put aside from both sides of the aisle. It is not a consideration. We have become, I think, even Dick, you would agree with me, we have become friends in our understanding of our need to be together, lock up arms in arms, and face this foe. And I think, as always, we represent this nation. And we are now showing this nation's unity in the halls of Congress, and you'll see it on these measures.
I totally agree with Dick. This has been an extraordinary response by the American people, and the Congress is right there with the people. We are shoulder to shoulder. We're working together in a bipartisan way. I've said this is a new world. I've told my caucus this is a new world. We have to throw out our old thinking. We have to be open to new ideas and new ways of doing things. We've got to rise to the occasion, and I think we're doing that. And I commend the Speaker and Dick Armey and their entire leadership and all of their members. They have been there with us every day, every minute of every day, working together, getting this done.
All right, Congressman, we have a caller, I believe from Florida, who wants to ask a question. Please go ahead with your question.
Yes?
Go ahead.
I just don't understand why we haven't had an immediate response of some sort. Admittedly, it's a long-term problem, but the anger and grief that we feel is going to turn to despair, and the economy will be ruined if you people...
What about that, Congressman Armey?
Well, one of the things you always have to understand, the American people know what's going on in their world. They know the complexities and the difficulties of this, and they understand that, you know, this is a whole different, as Dick said, a different kind of warfare, one that requires our commitment, but one that requires perhaps in other respects, like other wars in the past have not, the ability to be patient, thorough, and willing to make a peer investigation and then strike and strike hard. one thing that I want to remind us, this is a nation that does not spend its heroes on things like revenge. We are not trying to defeat another nation. We are not trying to win a war. We are trying to preserve liberty and keep people safe. And American people, I believe, will understand that will be done surgically in this case and therefore thoughtfully.
Congressman Gephardt, you have the last word.
I totally agree. We can't. The one thing we can't do is expend resources and people in a cause that doesn't succeed. We've got to be effective as our foes were. We've got to understand them. We've got to understand what it's going to take to defeat them. And then we have to execute that strategy when we have it together and when we think we have the maximum ability to get it done. I understand this caller's frustration. We are all frustrated beyond belief, but we can't let frustration guide our actions. We have to do this in a very smart, wise, sensible way.
Okay, the minority leader
for a posse, not a lynch mob.
All right, the minority leader and the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Richard Gephardt. Dick Armey, thanks for joining us on this day.
You bet.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's go to CNN's Darren Kagan now in Atlanta for a check of the latest developments in America's new war. Darren?
Well, thank you very much. We want to go ahead and start with new information that has been revealed about the U.S. military's response to the 4 hijacked airliners last Tuesday. According to Vice President Dick Cheney, orders were given by President Bush to shoot down incoming commercial airliners over Washington immediately after the terrorist attacks took place in New York and at the Pentagon. However, no fighters were able to intercept those airliners before they crashed. Also, the Pakistani government on Monday will ask the Taliban to hand over Osama bin Laden in 3 days or face massive military action led by American forces. U.S. officials do not expect the Taliban to cooperate on that one. In New York, Afghan ambassador to the UN, Ravon Farhadi, who represents the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan, that is the anti-Taliban movement in Afghanistan, he said that today the Northern Alliance will make 15,000 troops available for any attack against Taliban-held Afghanistan. And we have a correction to tell you about from earlier. CNN showed what law enforcement sources who are working with the FBI had told us were pictures of some of the alleged hijackers. We are now told, however, that by the FBI that the picture we showed for alleged hijacker Abdulaziz Al-Umari was incorrect. The man we actually showed was Abdul Rahman Al-Umari, whom the FBI says is not under investigation for the hijackings. CNN, of course, sincerely apologizes for that mistake. We want to move on and give you more information about the story that is developing today over word we're getting from Vice President Cheney that President Bush on Tuesday had given orders that it was okay to shoot down a commercial airliner if indeed it did pose a threat. And let's bring in our Miles O'Brien has more information on that. Miles.
Well, Darren, ever since that fateful morning, there's been a lot of speculation about the 4th and final aircraft that was hijacked, United Airlines Flight 93, which left Newark Airport bound for San Francisco. And this is a replay of FAA radar telemetry of that flight. It flew out pretty much on course, took a U-turn at Cleveland, so it went fairly far before the apparent hijacking occurred. And then, as we, of course, know, crashed into some rural country, a remote part of Pennsylvania. Now, the question was, it being the last flight of the 4, was there time for the U.S. military to intercept that flight with a fighter and be faced with the prospect of shooting it down for fear it was headed to, say, the U.S. Capitol or some other target in Washington? It was headed on a trajectory to the Washington area. Vice President Cheney on Meet the Press, the NBC program, had this to say just a little while ago.
The President made the decision on my recommendation as well, wholeheartedly concurred in the decision he made, that if the plane would not divert, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
All right, now a couple of things to consider here. First of all, there were fighter jets in the air by the time this situation was occurring, so it is possible that the timing would be such that a fighter jet might have had that opportunity had that plane continued on. It is routine in the case of a hijacking for the FAA to notify NORAD to scramble fighters to try to intercept the plane, try to get the plane, force them down onto the ground. We were talking with General Wesley Clark just a little while ago about what the options would have been for that fighter. Obviously, an absolute last resort. resort would be to squeeze the trigger. They would have tried perhaps to signal the plane down, try to force the plane down, and then ultimately, as a plane got nearer to the nation's capital, given what we've just heard, had the authorization to do what would have been a terrible, awful thing, and that would have been to squeeze the trigger and bring down a civilian airliner loaded with 35 passengers. Now, as we know, what happened, based on some conversations received by loved ones on the ground from passengers, what happened was the male passengers about this time here made the decision to attack the hijackers on the plane. They were told by their loved ones that the attacks had already occurred on the World Trade Center, in essence knew their fate, and apparently made the decision to attack the hijackers. We can only presume that there was a struggle which led to the crash there in Pennsylvania, thus taking the decision out of the hands of the U.S. military and perhaps an F-16 pilot. So that's just one more tidbit as to what was happening in the skies on that very fateful morning. Darren?
Well, and Miles brings up the question, as people around the country get on airliners again, is that something they have to face, the possibility that they too could be shot out of the sky if it turns out that they are on a jet that holds some kind of threat to something on the ground?
Just, add it to your list of worries here. I mean, that's one of the many things that we all have to contend with as we face the prospect of getting back on aircraft. And we do know this, and the Vice President was very pointed in saying this as well, that particularly over the nation's capital right now, there are fighter jets in the air at all times, so-called AWACS aircraft, airborne radar aircraft. So this statement was as much a little bit of history as it was, I think, a warning to would-be terrorists in the future, that not only is there the authorization potentially there, but the aircraft are already in the air.
All right, Miles O'Brien, thank you very much. Also want to talk about the call-up. We have been talking about the call-up of military reservists in recent days, thousands of them, about 35,000. But the question also comes into play, what about troops that are already in service, and what are the plans for them? Let's go to the Pentagon right now, and our Jamie McIntyre, who's standing by. Jamie, hello.
Good morning. Good afternoon. The message from the Pentagon is that the call-up of reservists right now is limited to protecting the United States, putting fighter planes in the air and watching what's going on in the skies, and assisting civil authorities in disaster relief in both New York and Washington. If the U.S. were to mount a major military operation, it would need to call up additional reserves. But listen very carefully what Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld says today, as he is trying to prepare Americans for a very different kind of war.
It is not a war that a military campaign deals with. It is a broad-based, sustained, we're talking about years, not weeks or days, and there are not armies, navies, and air forces to go after. They have no battleships. They have no aircraft carriers. These are people who operate in the shadows, and we have to deal with them in the shadows.
Same message from Secretary of State Colin Powell, of course, former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, telling CNN's Wolf Blitzer just a short time ago that this is not necessarily going to be a major military campaign. He described it as primarily an intelligence war, a law enforcement war. Yes, there may be military action. It may even involve troops on the ground, special operations forces going to try to arrest or capture suspected terrorists. But what the United States is trying to, what the Pentagon is trying to prepare the U.S. public for is a long campaign against terrorists that will have a military aspect to it, but will be something that will go on for a long time with the ultimate goal of making Americans feel more comfortable and less threatened by terrorists. And that is going to take years, and don't expect any necessarily quick military action. Darren?
And sounds unlike anything Americans have seen before this. Jamie, if you will, I want to go back to the report we were talking about with Miles O'Brien. Vice President Dick Cheney coming out today and saying that indeed on Tuesday, President Bush had given the okay, if needed, to shoot the commercial airline, United Airlines Flight 93, that was on its way from Newark to San Francisco, if need be, to shoot that commercial airline out of the sky. Anything you can add from the Pentagon angle?
Well, first of all, that would be obviously an option of absolute last resort. And what the U.S. is working on now is new procedures that would prevent the U.S. Air Force from ever getting into that situation of having to make that dreadful decision. One of the other real questions that's raised by the scrambling of jets and the alert that was given to the FAA is that whether or not there should have been some warning system to evacuate government buildings in Washington. Now, no one could have known that this jetliner was heading for the Pentagon, but it was known sometime before the event happened that the U.S. was under a terrorist attack. Certainly that was clear by the time the second jet hit the World Trade Center tower. It would take some very quick figuring, and this is all in hindsight, but if you were able to figure out that you were under a terrorist attack and you were able to evacuate government buildings in Washington, perhaps other buildings as well, there might have been some lowering of the death toll, but it's very hard to figure out. Same thing if you shoot down a plane. If you shoot down the plane that was heading for the Pentagon in this major Washington area, there are dozens of places it could have landed and caused even more casualties. So it's a very vexing problem.
A lot of tough choices. Jamie McIntyre at the Pentagon. Jamie, thank you very much. We want to focus now on Afghanistan. The Taliban opposition there has also offered assistance in bringing in suspected terrorist Osama bin Laden. Northern Alliance officials tell us that Osama bin Laden has gone into hiding since Tuesday's attack. Whatever the U.S. response is, the Afghan opposition tells CNN it does want to play a part.
We are fighting the enemy of the world, which I mean Osama bin Laden. If the United States of America is about to show a reaction against terrorists and their collaborators, they should consult us and see how much effective our support in our cooperation would be.
Meanwhile, another part of the story from Afghanistan, word of a possible military strike against Afghanistan is sending thousands fleeing to the borders. Many residents have evacuated the capital city of Kabul. Our Nick Robertson is there. He has more on the reaction to the threatened U.S. action.
Bustling trade in Afghanistan street markets belies an impending sense of isolation beginning to grip many Afghans. Concerns about the likelihood of an American attack and the possibility borders with Pakistan and Iran may close have driven food prices up 10 to 15%. Concern also, Afghan people could become innocent victims. They should wait until it's clear Osama was involved, this vendor says. America shouldn't make any attack on Afghanistan, this trader says, because the Afghan people are not involved and not responsible. Many here, however, are too poor to flee the cities. 22 years of conflict has ruined infrastructure and economy alike. The years of war have also built up a resilience among many Afghans, to the point where a new attack would be a continuation of their ongoing battles. The result of Russian aggression was the breaking of Russia into 16 countries, this old man says, remembering the 1980s Soviet occupation. If America attacks us, Allah will divide America into 52 pieces. From influential tribal elders, not necessarily aligned with the Taliban, however, a call for diplomacy.
We advise the Taliban that they must discuss everything with everyone and not close the doors to negotiation.
However, the tribal elders also said if Afghanistan is attacked, they will back the Taliban to the end, a sentiment echoed on the streets here. As the last of the international aid workers began leaving because the Taliban said they could no longer guarantee their safety, Afghanistan's total isolation appears now closer than ever. Nick Robertson, CNN, Kabul, Afghanistan.
And before we throw it back to Wolf, we want to show you some pictures that we just got in within the last hour here at CNN. CNN having a chance today, and our Aaron Brown going along for the ride with the Coast Guard. You're going to see the first aerial view of the destruction at the World Trade Center. And while we look at these pictures quickly, the mayor, Rudy Giuliani, confirming 180 deaths in New York so far. 115 of those have been identified. The mayor, though, revising the number of missing at the World Trade Center upward to 5,097. He says the rescue operation will go on until all hope is lost. And as well, as we toss it back to you, the mayor and the governor saying today that it is still very much considered a rescue operation.
Darren and I'll be speaking to Mayor Giuliani shortly. Later in this program, I'll also be speaking with the Pakistani ambassador to the United States. But joining us now are 5 members of the United States Senate. Here in Washington, Michigan Senator Carl Levin, he's the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Virginia Senator John Warner, he's the ranking member of the Armed Services Committee. Indiana Senator Richard Lugar, he's a member of the Intelligence Committee. And from Boston, Massachusetts, Senator John Kerry, he's also a member of the Foreign Relations Committee. And in our Miami Bureau, Senator Bob Graham, he's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. Senators, thanks to all of you for joining us. First of all, to you, Senator Lugar, what should the United States do right now?
Two things. The diplomacy that's been described is essential. Not only Pakistan, but try to identify those interests that Russia, China, other nations have with us with regard to terrorism. That is going to have to be a long-term project, but the short-term aspects of it are obvious. The NATO declaration, obviously the work in Pakistan, but the trying to find how we get a network of support that is important if we're going to root it out. And secondly, in the homeland defense, not only the FBI investigations, but reorganization of our own government so that the National Guard units, our armed forces, the first providers, are in a network that clearly is not very well centralized or organized, despite a lot of discussion about that. These are essential to guard not only our airlines, but communications and financial situations. I would just add to this, obviously, the work against proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and materials has to be intensified. If, in fact, terrorists finally do get their hands on any of it, then the effects would be absolutely devastating, not just single buildings at a time.
Let me ask Senator Graham, he's the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. How serious of a threat is that, Senator Graham, that the next time around it might not just be airliners filled with gasoline and passengers, but it could be nuclear or biological or chemical agents?
There's a saying that the generals always fight the last war, and we need to be careful not to be overly obsessed with the hijacking of airplanes as the means of carrying out terrorist offenses. I agree with Senator Lugar that the next may be a chemical or biological weapon inside a suitcase. In answer to your question about what our immediate priorities are, I think first is continuing the efforts to see if there are any survivors in the rubble of New York or the Pentagon. Second, the CIA briefed me earlier today the fact that we are not certain that Tuesday was the only act of terrorism in this plan, that there are still possibilities both outside and inside the United States of further terrorist activities, and so we need to be on a very aggressive level to root out all the information that we can about that and try to interdict any future acts of terrorism. And third, we need to continue the investigation to determine precisely who committed this horrendous assault against America and be able to rally the world community in a united front against these specific terrorists and terrorism in general.
So what you're saying, Senator Graham, based on this intelligence briefing that you had, is that Americans here in the United States and Americans traveling around the world who may be watching this program right now should remain on guard?
Absolutely, and not just Americans. That the part of the plan may have been to be executed outside the United States, aimed at U.S. citizens, but also at citizens of other countries.
Senator Levin, you're the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. We've heard from our Pentagon correspondent. We've heard from the Secretary of State. This is not the normal kind of military operation that the United States is used to. What can you tell us about the next specific military steps that might be necessary?
Those are being looked at. The options are all being considered, but if I knew which options were going to be used, I would not share them with you here. I don't think we yet know what will be the most effective options. What we do know are a couple things. One is that it must succeed. So it's got to be carefully planned and executed. We can't just strike back in a way which is ineffective. Secondly, it's very clear to me that if we have a broad alliance with us, we will be much more effective. If we have some Muslim nations with us, it'll be far more effective, because if we don't have Muslim nations with us when we strike back, and we will, then bin Laden and his types will be able to say, aha, it's us against them. If Muslim nations join with us, it will not play into bin Laden's hands as it otherwise might. That is our long-range goal, is to go after terrorists, not play in their hands, and that means it's the world versus terrorism, not the West versus Islam.
Senator Kerry, you're, of course, well known as a Vietnam veteran. When the United States got involved in the early 60s in Vietnam, it looked a lot different, of course, than when the U.S. left in the 70s. Are you at all concerned that what the U.S. is getting itself involved in right now could turn out to be another Vietnam?
I mean, it just isn't. There isn't even any comparison. I mean, the country is united, galvanized, I think is the word. because we have been attacked in the most clear and dastardly way. I mean, every American understands the nature of this threat, and not every American clearly understood the nature of our presence in Vietnam. And I think that the key here, and I think the President understands it, and I think each of the comments you've heard from my colleagues, and particularly the comments you heard from Secretary Rumsfeld today, I thought they were good comments and very important ones, and from Secretary Powell. No one is articulating this as a quick event. No one is suggesting that this is going to be war as we've known it in the past. This is different. And Americans need to recognize that. We all need to recognize that. There's a lot of thinking to do. There's a huge amount of adjusting to do. There's a great deal that we need to do on the diplomatic front. And part of this war will be exactly that, a different kind of diplomacy. Much of it will be a very different kind of intelligence effort, both the intelligence gathering and the level to which we undertake it, as well as those things that the intelligence community may engage in. We're going to have to change those rules. In addition to that, we clearly will have some kinds of military events. I am convinced, all of us, we will need to. But we've got to remember who the target is here. We don't want to create, I think it was Carl Levin who just mentioned this. I mean, we cannot allow this to become Islam versus the rest of the world, or the rest of the world versus Islam. Islam is a peaceful religion. The Taliban itself is led by people who are not particularly steeped in religion or schooled in religion. They're not religious leaders as we've known them within the Islamic world. And I think that we have to recognize that Islam itself needs to be part of defining its own peaceful existence and desires, and recognize the threat to all of the world through this kind of terrorist activity.
Let me bring in Senator Warner, who used to be the chairman of the Armed Services Committee. Now you're the ranking Republican, the ranking member. Your home state, your state of Virginia, took a direct hit at the Pentagon. Did you ever in your life think that something like this could happen at the Pentagon and at the World Trade Center?
No, Wolf. I spent 5 years there during Vietnam as Undersecretary, Secretary of the Navy. And while fiction wrote these things up, none of us ever thought it could happen. But the one thing here, it did happen, and it may have happened at a point in time when we can now go to war, as the President said, against terrorists and prevent them from getting weapons which, it's hard to believe, cause greater destruction to the United States, whether they're chemical, biological, or the missile attacks, which concern me. But let me just point out.
Well, let me just interrupt for 1 second, Senator Warner.
We ought to start every one of these discussions with expressing our prayers and our hearts for the victims, particularly on this day, Sunday. Every night I go to bed, every morning I get up. They're foremost in my mind. Now, your question.
And I agree completely with you, but the question is this. Why did it take this kind of a disaster to mobilize the U.S. government, the American people, if you will, to get engaged in this war on terrorism?
When Carl and I have been in our committee now 23 years, when I was chairman, I set up a special subcommittee on the Armed Services Committee called Emerging Threats. And for the 2.5 years I was chairman, we were working very hard to try and to look into the future, to put our dollars and assets where they're best needed to combat just the type of thing that we saw happen. Other parts of the Congress were working, but not with the commitment that we have today. We're unified behind our great president. And I want to say to the American people, part of that support has to be the exercise of patience and understanding. We cannot answer every question. Some of us may have answers to it, but it's not in our security interest to say it. The people understandably want direct action, be it military or otherwise. It is wise, and when I was with the President just 2 days ago, he was calm, confident, well-informed, and he will act at such time as he and his advisors are absolutely certain that's the time to act. So we've got to exercise patience and support, and part of that is understanding that all of us here in Washington are working together as a team, unified in the Congress.
Let me bring your chairman back for a second and ask you the same question. Why did it have to take this kind of devastation? We've been hearing about terrorist threats for God knows how long. Why did it take this to mobilize the government?
Because here the attack was brought to not just to Americans, but to Americans in a huge way on our homeland. This is different in the scope of the attack. But by the way, I think many of us have been fighting very hard to move dollars into the fight against terrorism and away from some of the lesser threats. And that's really what should have been done, looking back. And I pray and believe will be done now is that the most likely threats are the terrorist threats. We've been saying that number of years, including some of the folks in both houses of Congress. And I think that now that has been proven clearly the correct path, and that's where we're heading.
All right, Senator Lugar, you want to weigh in on this?
I would just say that until this point, a large number of the American public were not as interested in foreign policy and defense policy. As a matter of fact, the debate we're about to have on the defense appropriation bill was in question as to whether there would be support for even the fairly modest desires the president had. Now that debate changed because the public changed its mind, and we are fortified by that public resolve.
Senator Graham, you must feel, I was going to say, Senator Graham, you must feel totally frustrated as the chairman of the Intelligence Committee that it took this to get the kind of action that apparently is going to happen right now.
Well, let's put this incident, however, in some context. There have been many previous terrorist initiatives in the United States which have been understood and collapsed before they could be a threat. We had one just a few months ago when a person tried to come across the Canadian border in the state of Washington, clearly with a terrorist intent. This event of Tuesday, this terrible tragedy, is clearly a failure, and it cannot be described otherwise. It needs to be a failure which is an alarm signal that we need to heighten our efforts. The Senate Intelligence Committee will be introducing legislation this week to try to create a better command structure for terrorism response in the United States. We also have already recommended substantial increases in dollars for spies, for better technology, for eavesdropping, for better ability to analyze the tremendous volume of information we collect. We think those will be seen to be weaknesses in our intelligence system that contributed to Tuesday's tragedy. We don't want any of those weaknesses to continue a day longer.
What weakness, Senator Kerry, what weakness do you believe that this failure last Tuesday in the intelligence community, failure to get any advance warning that meant anything, failure in the security community, that these planes were hijacked simultaneously, almost, including 2 planes in Boston, the capital of your state. Tell us what immediate fix can be put forward to reassure the American public.
Well, first of all, I'm supportive, and I will be advocating it this week. We actually have a hearing on it. The takeover of our airline security by the federal government for a lot of different reasons. I spent some time in law enforcement. I know the value of getting state police talking to the local police, talking to the federal authorities, exchanging warrant information, movements between states. We never used to do that. Now we do it fairly well. But here, when you come into the country with your passport is checked, people can tell where you've traveled, where you've been, whether you're on a watch list, and so forth. We have none of that capacity in our airlines today. Unless you fly El Al and you're going to Israel, you don't go through a very lengthy interview, and it's been rather porous, and most Americans know it. And it was porous because, frankly, the business community and a lot of other people wanted it that way. They just wanted to be able to move quickly and easily. Now we know we can't. So I think if you had a coordinated effort whereby there was a sharing of information and a greater scrutiny with respect to who's boarding an aircraft, that's one piece of it. The second piece is you can guarantee that never again will an aircraft be used as a weapon. And the way you do it is by making it clear to every terrorist who's a prospective terrorist that they may get into an airplane, but they will never succeed in being able to pass into the pilot's cockpit because those doors are sealed for all purposes. So while they may kill a flight attendant or they may kill the whole airplane and themselves, they will not be able to fly it into a target. These are things that we can guarantee. But let me come back to a point. Again, I think it was made earlier. Bob Graham said it. Let's not get hung up on the notion that what happened on Tuesday is going to be the preferred avenue of attack in whatever may happen down the road. I assure you it will not be. Probably no American will be safer flying in these next few days ever in history than they will be now. And the terrorists know that. So the next target will be something different, whether it's cyberspace, whether it's our water supplies or food or some other, a bridge, a tunnel. And this is why it is so imperative that we not recognize the solution to this is to give up our freedom. The solution to this is to secure our freedom by destroying the willpower and capacity of these terrorists to do this. And that is a longer, far more painstaking, but much more important mission for all of us now. And we need to focus on the cells and on the efforts in other countries.
Let's take a caller from Houston who has a question. Please go ahead, Houston, with your question.
Yeah, gentlemen, the news reports have said that the terrorists have had people in place in U.S. military-run schools. What I was curious about, what is the possibility of these terrorists being in place in our military as far as troops or even higher-ranking officers? And is the FBI investigating this?
Well, let's ask the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, first of all. What can you tell us about these reports that 3 or 4, perhaps 5 of these 19 terrorists who died in these hijackings, some of them at least, may have received training at U.S. military facilities?
We've asked for a report on that, and we'll get it. But I think it's important in the meantime that we not start becoming so suspicious of ourselves that we're going to lose our freedoms and, as a matter of fact, lose the ability just to have a life which is a relatively normal life. I don't believe that there's infiltration in the higher levels of our military. I don't think we should become paranoid. Obviously, we got to become more cautious, but we cannot let the terrorists destroy the fabric of our relationships, or else they would have succeeded.
Senator Warner, is it time to take a look at some of those programs where the United States brings individuals from other countries around the world and trains them to fly planes?
It's time to look at everything. Those programs have produced very valuable relationships over the years between ourselves and other countries in times of crisis. Those military people, having received training here, feel a certain loyalty and have stepped up. Let me go back and pick up on one thing. We are, this president, not, like his father, building a coalition. But those of us who watched carefully the engagement in Kosovo, where we had to sit with 19 nations in NATO around a table, and all had to be agreed before we did anything, we cannot follow that again. We cannot share, I think, as fully as we have, need all the intelligence, because these people move swiftly and quietly, and when we have them pinpointed, we've got to go. And on that point, there's discussion, well, should we use ground troops? Let me pick up. We have got to say that every asset of the United States is available to engage. The moment we take off the table some potential we have, whether it's through ground forces or other things, then the terrorists are going to skillfully plan to use that vacuum as their next avenue of attack. So everything should be on the table, all plans reviewed, and if we stand united behind our president, exercise patience, we're going to survive as a stronger nation.
Can I add one thing to that, Wolf, because I agree with it, but there's another aspect. We will be far more effective if other nations join with us. We can't take any of our own assets off the table. We've got to be ready for anything, and if necessary, to act alone, obviously. But we will be far more effective if it is a coalition, and will be doubly effective if some Islamic nations are part of that coalition. So it is not viewed in the Islamic world as the West versus Islam. It's got to be the West, including Islam, versus terrorists.
Senator Lugar, you're well known as one of the authorities in the Senate on international affairs. The opposite of what Senator Levin is saying is that if the U.S. tries to bring in all of these other coalition partners, it will restrict U.S. maneuverability, the U.S. ability to do what it believes is the best, take the best course of action. Are you at all concerned about that?
Well, there are a lot of restrictions if we're not able to get cooperation. I would agree with John Warner. We are not a group of 19, but we need to find out where we have common interest, where somebody is willing to work with us. We need to determine what we need to do. But I would just say one of the aspects of this, ironically, is we probably need to have more military people from other countries training with us. The problem here with the pilots was a lot of them were trained by civilian folks here in the United States, not our military. We are going to have to try to tie together with the military, with the diplomatic corps, but even more so with the intelligence people, unsavory as they may be, internationally with Russia, China, whoever is going to help us, because each one of these countries has a problem with militant Muslims on their border. They understand that, and it's the gut thing that's likely to bring them into our camp in this issue.
Senator Graham, you're the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. As you know, there's a lot of intelligence types in Washington have been grumbling for years, especially since 1995, that they've had sort of one hand tied behind their back. They haven't been able to go out and recruit sources, agents within these terrorist cells, put them on the U.S. government's payroll, if you will, out of fear that they would be criticized by Congress. How do you deal with that issue of having to get down there in the gutter, if you will, with rats if necessary?
Let me first comment on Senator Lugar's statement. I completely agree with what he and Carl Levin have said. I was in Pakistan 2 weeks ago, and prior to that time had a briefing from some Russian officials about their view of Afghanistan. And the Russians are as concerned about the Taliban as we are. They fought a 10-year war against the Taliban. Afghanistan is the principal source of heroin that's coming in to Russia. It is a destabilizing entity relative to those rather already unstable states on the southern border of Russia. So we have the potential of building an alliance based on self-interest of these other countries. As it relates to our restrictions, we've had a policy, particularly in the CIA, that we would not hire a foreign national who had an unsavory background. The fact is, if you want to get somebody to get close to bin Laden and be able to understand what he's thinking about and what actions he may be likely to take, I would not suggest that you go to the monastery to try to find that person. The people that have the ability to get close are likely to be people pretty much like the ones who are now working with bin Laden. So we've got to be more pragmatic in terms of our willingness to accept the fact that if it's important to us to be able to understand terrorist activities early enough to stop them from occurring, then we are likely to have as one of our tactics the ability to deal with some unsavory people who can serve a legitimate purpose of intelligence for the benefit of the United States people.
Senator Kerry, are you ready to go along with that and put some of these unsavory types, terrorists who have a lot of blood on their hands, on the U.S. government's payroll as sources, as agents inside, for example, Al-Qaeda, Osama bin Laden's organization?
Well, obviously, if they're well managed and within the limits of what you're trying to achieve, it's important to sometimes do that. I mean, when I was a prosecutor, we had an old saying. I mean, all prosecutors have the saying, when you're trying the devil, you don't go to heaven for your witnesses. And so it's fairly obvious that if you're going to try to get information, you're going to have to deal with these folks. And we've gotten a little bit goody two-shoes about it in the wake of a lot of other kinds of problems that we faced in the past. This is a different kind of fight now. We're not talking about states or countries or people who once upon a time adhered to some kind of international standard, who had a rule of law. These are complete renegades. These are terrorists. Their mission is to spread terror. They are attacking the very foundations of civilized society. And everybody has something at stake in that. So I'm absolutely prepared to use the tools necessary. When you're waging a war, you do what's necessary to win. And obviously, because we are the United States of America, we have always interpreted that to mean within our value system and without losing the best of what makes us different from other countries as the United States. But I'm prepared to do things differently.
Senator Warner, the Vice President Dick Cheney confirmed today that when one of those planes, those hijacked planes, was going towards Washington, U.S. fighter jets were authorized to shoot that plane down if necessary. I want to listen once again to what the Vice President said earlier today and get your reaction. Listen to this. Now, we don't have that soundbite, but let me read it to you, what what Vice President
I know
Cheney
it
said.
by heart.
Well, our viewers, I want to remind our viewers, if the plane would not divert, the hijacked plane, if they wouldn't pay any attention to instructions to move away from the city, as a last resort, our pilots were authorized to take them out.
I accept that statement at face value, and it's one that we'll be examining this week, and what other steps we can put as a precaution, hopefully not to do that. You know, in this wonderful discussion we've had among 6 good friends and colleagues, I think what comes to the forefront that the Congress is unified behind the President. I ask Congress, as has others. Dick Gephardt was here with a brilliant statement a minute ago. We've got to get together, pass on these issues with a minimum of dissent, some debate, which is constructive to explain to the American people what we do. I hope my colleague, Chairman Levin, and I, as we've worked together these 23 years, can get our bill up and give the President those things that he has asked for and which today and tomorrow and in the future he needs to defend this nation.
Senator Levin, I asked Secretary Powell earlier today if it was time to rethink the current ban that's been in effect since 1976, the prohibition on assassination. And he said it's time to rethink everything, in effect. I'm paraphrasing what he said. Is it time to perhaps lift that ban?
I think it's time to rethink everything, and some of the things we have to do secretly and quietly, regardless of what the express and the outward ban is. But I think we have to look at all options, including that, and whether it's done openly or whether it's done quietly, depending on the evidence and the circumstances. I think we have to we have to be willing to do that under the circumstances. As far as shooting down the plane is concerned, I'm glad to hear that they were able to move that quickly, to be able to take that action if necessary. Where I was a little surprised was that even though we had perhaps a half hour's notice that that plane aiming at the Pentagon had turned around, that there was no warning inside of the Pentagon or public buildings or other buildings in Washington. That is something that we will look to over time. In the moment, for the moment though, and I just visited the Pentagon again this morning, by the way, the people who are working at the Pentagon are heroes and heroines right now doing extraordinary work with huge American background and a totally united American people in Congress. It is a very impressive people, and a very impressive thing, and people should be aware of it all over the country, that this is a united country and that we have thousands of people donating volunteering services and money right now in a common effort.
Senator Lugar, I just want your reaction on that issue of rethinking the whole matter of assassinations.
Everything will be rethought, but I would just say the last retaliatory strike against bin Laden was a self-defense measure. And my guess is that we will define what occurs as defense, as self-defense, as justifiable. I think that was a reasonable interpretation at that time. I think that's reasonable now.
Senator Kerry, I just want your thoughts on this. I know that you've been studying this for some years. Rethink the policy of assassinations?
Certainly with regard to terrorism, no question about it. And I think that there is no question that we are going to have to do a great deal on the clandestine front here, our intelligence gathering, how we execute afterwards with respect to the information that we have found. I'm not sure any of us want to share all the options publicly at this point in time, but it's clear that, all of us have to put this in an historical perspective. This is different from anything that has happened previously to us. And the threat it poses to us is larger even than what happened to the World Trade Center. These people believe we are the infidels. They think we are the great Satan. They are conducting a deeply religious, deeply ideological war against us and have been for a long period of time. Our embassies have been blown up. Our ships have been blown up. Our airplanes have already been blown out of the sky or directed out of the sky. And we are now witnessing the last escalation. The United States and the civilized world cannot sit by and watch this happen. So we have to respond in whatever way we defend ourselves appropriately.
Unfortunately, Senator Kerry, we could go on. I want to thank you. I want to thank Senator Graham and our Miami Bureau, Senator Warner, of course, Senator Lugar, Senator Levin. Thanks to all of you for joining us.
Could I have 5 seconds to tell you something to show you how America can come back? Yesterday, the USS Cole was launched. She's back in the fleet. There's a clear example of the resolve in this country to fight back.
On that note, I want to thank all of the senators for joining us today. Thank you very much. And world leaders are declaring that a strike against the United States is a strike against all of the civilized world. CNN's chief international correspondent Christiane Amanpour spoke to the British Prime Minister Tony Blair earlier today. She joins us now live from London. Christiane, give us the headlines.
Well, the headlines, I think, Wolf, are that Tony Blair, first of all, having been one of the first and loudest condemning the bomb attack on the United States and standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, today said for the first time that he, like President Bush, views what happened as an act of war and a declaration of war. He then went on to say that that they were still waiting for the evidence and that, the future action was being considered, but that he believed there would be a very strong international coalition and that Britain would most likely, I read this between the lines, take part in any military action.
I'm very pleased at the way that America and the American administration has gone out of its way to consult its allies, to keep us fully informed so that we are part of the deliberations they're making. But we have to do two things, in my view. First of all, there has to be a response to bring those terrorists who committed this attack to account, and we will play our full part in that. And secondly, there has then to be an agenda that we construct at an international level that involves the whole of the international community in dismantling the machinery of international terrorism, how it's financed, how these people move about the world, the countries that then harbour them and give them help.
Now, what the Prime Minister was talking about was a long and sustained and difficult intelligence-gathering campaign, detective work, and all the kinds of non-military kind of work that will have to go in to the way the world leaders are describing their campaign to cut off the head of these terrorist cells. There has been unprecedented international support for the United States, and coming from not only the usual allies around the world, but also from some of the least suspected areas. For instance, in Iran, for the first time, hardliners and reformers condemned this attack. Iran, of course, has been accused of sponsoring terrorism in the past. They had a moment of silence at a football game. The mayor of Tehran sent a message to the mayor of New York today. I mean, these are unprecedented things. In Yemen, in all the other countries around that region, an enormous amount of political support for the United States at this moment. Wolf?
Christiane Amanpour in London, once again, thank you very much. I want to go now to the Pakistani ambassador to the United States, Malia Lodi. She joins us now in our Washington bureau. Madam Ambassador, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Tell us the latest from your government. Is the government of Pakistan issuing an ultimatum to the Taliban and, in effect, to Osama bin Laden to hand over Osama bin Laden within 3 days?
Well, as you know, there are UN sanctions on Afghanistan, and that prohibit travel to that country. What we have done today is to approach the UN Sanctions Committee for permission to allow a delegation from Pakistan to travel to Kandahar to urge upon the Taliban leadership the gravity of the situation, as well as to accede to the demand of the international community. And that demand, as you know, is now expressed in resolutions of the UN Security Council as well as the UN General Assembly, which call for all countries of the world to join in the war against terrorism and to bring to justice the perpetrators of those who carried out these terrible attacks, these terrible terrorist attacks in New York and in Washington.
All right, let's walk through the process right now. When will this delegation from Pakistan go to Afghanistan and meet with the Taliban?
We are expecting this delegation to fly out tomorrow once we have received permission from the UN Sanctions Committee, which will allow that plane to travel to Afghanistan.
And then what happens then? Will the demand be that Osama bin Laden be handed over to the government of Pakistan?
I think the important issue right now is that we will be urging upon the Taliban leadership something that we have been talking to their representative in Islamabad as well, which is to accede to the demand of the international community. And you know what that demand is.
Spell it out for our viewers. They're watching all over the world right now.
The demand is to bring to justice the perpetrators of the crime that has been committed, which we regard in Pakistan as a crime against humanity, to hand over the the person that they are harboring, Osama bin Laden, so that he is brought to justice.
And so just to be specific, the government of Pakistan does believe that Osama bin Laden and his al-Qaeda organization were responsible for these terrorist outrages.
Well, as you know, senior officials of the U.S. administration regard Osama bin Laden as a prime suspect. We are responding to the call of the international community as well as the United States in helping to see what we can do and try to use the diplomatic option before more extreme ways are evolved to deal with the situation.
Now, as you well know, Madam Ambassador, a lot of U.S. officials are skeptical that the Taliban will cooperate, will indeed find Osama bin Laden and hand him over to the international community. What happens if the Taliban simply says no?
Well, I think it's very clear that right now several options are being considered. We don't know how the response will evolve and how it will unfold. But I think what is clear, and as a member state, Pakistan is a member state of the United Nations, and under international law, we stand ready to implement all the decisions of the Security Council, and those decisions you're well aware of. They call upon all countries to help in the war against terrorism. We stand with the international community. We are consulting very closely right now with other Islamic countries, particularly our close friend and ally, Saudi Arabia, to ensure that we are all united and that the world is united in this war against terrorism. Let me tell you, my country has been afflicted by this menace for the last 2 decades. Pakistan has confronted terrorism in various forms. So we know exactly how it feels when you have to deal with something like this. There is no way that we can deal with this monster unless the world is united on this. And we stand ready to help and to extend our fullest cooperation to the international community to bring this menace to an end.
Let's talk about that help that the U.S. government will be seeking from your government. We heard Secretary Powell say on this program earlier that within the next few days, a high-level U.S. delegation will be sent to Islamabad, to Pakistan, to discuss cooperation between the two governments. Has the government of Pakistan made a fundamental decision to cooperate, if necessary, militarily with the U.S.?
I am not at liberty. I cannot discuss specific proposals that the U.S. administration has made to us, but I do want to reassure listeners, viewers, as well as others in the administration that our indication of firm support and fullest cooperation to the international community as well as the United States is firm and solid. Specific proposals are under discussion. You will appreciate the sensitivity of these matters. And I'm not at liberty to discuss specific proposals that have been made to us, but we will do whatever it takes to ensure that we stand with the international community to do what is necessary.
You know, of course, the many reports that one of the issues, one of the requests from the United States is to permit Pakistani airspace to be used, if necessary, for missiles or for U.S. planes, other planes, to fly over because Afghanistan is landlocked, as you know. Has the government of Pakistan accepted that proposal?
We have, again, you know, I can only answer this in the way that we have indicated a firm policy of support and cooperation. I cannot go into specific proposals that have been made to us by the United States because, as you know, the situation is evolving and I cannot discuss these in public.
I can understand that. One of the issues that was raised in one of the statements our Tom Mintier is reporting from Islamabad, he said that the Pakistani government, in expressing its willingness to cooperate with the United States, is imposing a condition that the government of Israel and the government of India not be included in any sort of coalition that would work against Osama bin Laden. Is that, in fact, the position of your government?
I'm not aware of anybody asking us in the first place about who will be part of this coalition. So, quite honestly, it's a hard question for me to answer because it's extremely hypothetical. What we have emphasized is the need for Islamic countries to be together on this, and Islamic countries are together on this. I think it's important for this international coalition to have a strong and visible component from the Islamic countries for obvious reasons. That is the point that we have made.
Well,
now, if somebody is characterizing that
just to
differently,
be precise, no one was suggesting that anyone had asked Pakistan for suggestions on who should be included. This was supposedly a Pakistani initiative. Just don't include Israel or India in this coalition. It'll make it a lot easier for Pakistan to cooperate.
I think we're going into specifics here. I'm not aware of anything of the sort that you're mentioning, but I think our sensitivities on these issues should be kept in view.
One of the statements that was issued yesterday by the Taliban leadership is this, and I want to play it. A Taliban spokesman making this statement earlier this weekend. Listen to this.
If neighboring or regional countries, particularly Islamic countries, gave a positive response to American demand for military bases, it would spark up extraordinary danger. Similarly, if any neighboring country gave territorial way or airspace to USA against our land, it would draw us into an imposed war.
That sounds like a direct threat to your government from the Taliban not to cooperate with the U.S.
My government has taken a decision to cooperate with the international community, and we will do so.
Is there a quid pro quo? Is there anything you're asking the United States to provide Pakistan in exchange for your cooperation with the U.S.?
We are going to be cooperating as part of our international commitment to deal with the menace of terrorism. This is not the time to nickel and dime on these issues, and we're not engaged with that. However, we do expect our friends to help us manage the risks which are obvious in a situation as we go down this road. There is an immediate response that we know will have to be made, and then there is a sustained longer-term response that will have to be evolved. In this, obviously, we expect our friends to help us manage the situation. As you know very well, extremism grows in situations of economic decline. Extremism is born of despair and desperation. And my country has been through a difficult economic period, and we certainly expect our friends to help us through our difficult economic difficulties.
And as you know, I was in Pakistan last year, and I spent several days there meeting with high-ranking officials, but also with many other people. And the despair that is felt, the anger towards the United States for supposedly abandoning Pakistan after the Afghanistan war has been translated to some significant support for Osama bin Laden.
Well, I think there are people who hold different points of view in Pakistan, and we have seen extremist points of view also being voiced in Pakistan, and you heard it for yourself. But we take comfort from the fact that the vast majority of Pakistanis are practicing Muslims, but they are moderate Muslims. That is also borne out by the fact that in every successive election that has taken place in Pakistan, the religious or the extremist parties have never done terribly well. In fact, combined, the religious parties have never been able to get more than 2 or 3% of the popular vote. That is a statement about the quintessence of the Pakistani nation, which is moderate and which is tolerant. That is the Pakistan that is extending its fullest cooperation to the international community on this issue.
U.S. intelligence sources have told me over the past few years they have a deep concern that some of the groups associated with Osama bin Laden may be gaining a foothold even within the Pakistani military. Is that a serious concern that the U.S. and others should have?
Well, I have not heard any U.S. official say that to my side or to me. I think we need to keep our focus on the cooperation. As you know, there are close consultations going on between our two countries. The presidents of our two countries have spoken yesterday on the telephone. We need to keep our focus where it really belongs, which is how to fight this menace to ensure also that there is security in the region where my country is situated. We are situated in a very volatile and dangerous part of the world. Obviously, we seek longer-term security and peace in our region. As I said, there is an immediate response, but we also have to look longer-term to see that we have an approach that deals with some of the underlying reasons which give rise to people who hold extremist views.
As you know, your president, Pervez Musharraf, was scheduled to come to New York to the United Nations for the opening of the General Assembly. Is he still planning on coming here?
No, he has. We have, in fact, conveyed to the administration the fact that he has cancelled his visit. He obviously does not wish at this point to be a burden at a time when your country is going through such an extraordinary crisis. I also wanted to take this opportunity, Wolf, if you will allow me, to offer our sincerest condolences from the people and the government of Pakistan to the American people. We share your grief and we share the grief of the victims of this terrible tragedy. I just wanted you to know that.
Thank you very much, Malia Lodi, the ambassador of Pakistan to the United States. I assume you're going to be on this program frequently in the next few weeks and months. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.
And now let's go back to the CNN Center in Atlanta. Darren Kagan is standing by with a check of the latest developments in America's new war. Just one note, Darren, when we come back after the news, we're going to continue these conversations. We're going to have a panel, the U.S. intelligence community also have a panel on some religious leaders and what they're thinking and saying on this day. Darren?
Yes, and Wolf, they have been fascinating discussions to listen to. Also, we know our viewers are interested in the developments, and there have been a number of developments today following last week's terrorist attack, so let's get right to them. First, to Vice President Dick Cheney, who says that President Bush did give orders to shoot down incoming commercial airlines over Washington. That was immediately after terrorist attacks in New York and at the Pentagon on Tuesday, if those planes were judged to be a threat. At the time, one hijacked plane was heading toward